technically, I shouldn't have called for a smoko stop there, but I thought everyone needed it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go till 1 o'clock, and we'll have lunch at 1 o'clock, which affects some other issues. So at the last piece of lunch, I need to just talk to councillors about something, an issue that I need your okay on, which is unrelated to this. So I'd like to meet you somewhere. James, I thought we'd go to 1 o'clock.
Okay. 1 o'clock.
For this meeting.
By Karamoana room, 1 o'clock.
Okay. So if councillors could have some quick lunch, and then there's something else I need to discuss with you. Okay. Flow enhancement. Otherwise known as augmentation. I know you don't like that. Okay, so yesterday we did get to a point of Nye went over his map on the Rapi, which is Rauperi, which is
Rauperi, freeze.
I'm getting different versions here. It's like
Point of order. Rauperi.
Which is, of course, a piece of water that is extremely well known to me and of interest. So, I don't know who we want to kick this off. Tanya?
Should have finished my biscuit then put my hand up. But just as introductory comments, I want to thank our tangata whenua representatives and our advisors for being here today. And in the spirit of sharing information and being informed about the different views, just to be mindful that you're somewhat put on the spot in this moment. So they're here to share the views that we discussed yesterday, but of course they're just 4 people up the front sharing what they've heard and their analysis. So if we can just bear that in mind, and I'll leave it to them.
I'm not sure that I don't want long dissertations from everybody on this. I think we had that yesterday. The tangata whenua advisors are up there to add advice where it's required. So what we did arrive to this morning, I guess, when you said that tangata whenua aren't entirely and absolutely against flow enhancement, or call it the right thing, but you would want it as a backstop, is that the right word? Not as a principle that just gets used.
Can I speak on that?
Certainly.
Yeah, I think our main concern as people who are members of this committee is sustainable management of the resource, and we see lots of areas where people can be more responsible in terms of the use of their water. I have raised the issue on a number of times where I've driven along the road and I've seen raining and people have got their water sprinklers on, and people who grow maize like myself with water sprinklers on, we don't need, we still get a good return. So there's definitely areas where people can cut down, and one of the issues for tangata whenua is we have had our mahinga kai compromised quite seriously in terms of other people's use of water. In places where we've got freshwater crayfish, flounders, eels, you name it, they no longer exist, or they don't actually have those species in there anymore. So, and as members of this regional council, we also have social obligations as well. And one of those social obligations has been identified that Hawke's Bay's got one of the highest rates of cancer in the area. And one of those reasons would be the amount of spray that's circling around in the air from much intensive horticulture. So there are a range of issues that we have to consider, because at the end of the day, we are all interested in the health and well-being of our citizens, or our ratepayers. So, I just think we should consider the wider issues as well. Thank you.
So, thanks, Toto. Where's the point that we can agree on here? That where's Tangata Whenua's point? We know where Tank's point is. Where is Tangata Whenua's point?
So I'll invite Billy.
Billy?
And if we manage our water wisely, then this issue of augmentation may not be necessary. So we should focus on wise management first. Augmentation, that is a secondary thing that we might need to consider in the case of emergencies, but I think the focus needs to be wise water management.
So, Mr. Chairman, doesn't that suggest that maybe we need to make a little more concrete our discussion of the water efficiency, water conservation aspects of this first, because that becomes, in a way, the, if I can use the term, the enabler of the issue of enhancement is then it's another arrow in the quiver, as opposed to being perceived as the solution to what is deemed to be excessive water use. So we talked yesterday about a 10%, about stipulating a savings goal target in the plan. The plan in its detail has provisions in it like any irrigator has to demonstrate that they're meeting 80% efficiency goals, that sort of thing. I was looking at papers last night from Napier that Napier has a goal of reducing per capita water use from 440 liters a day to 300. That's a pretty substantial reduction. And so from my standpoint, it's always been a paramount objective of this exercise to first establish that we were using the water we did have as efficiently as it could possibly be used. And so it seems totally appropriate for this plan to set a target of some kind, or targets of some kind. And it just sounds like that would go, that would be a better of further discussion on some of the other issues here.
That's two. Item 2. 90 cubes down to 80 over a 10-year period.
Yeah, I don't know whether that's the right, I mean, it just seems to me that is, everybody that has been talking about water efficiency outside of this context, but generally in the business, there seems to be a lot of water sloshing around out there, whether you're an irrigator, whether you're a residential user, whatever. There's a lot of water sloshing around out there, so let's bite the bullet and say, yeah, there is, and here's what this plan is going to attempt to do about that. And that's a fundamental, that has to be seen as a fundamental goal of this plan change, it seems to me. There has to be some numbers on it. And I don't see any reason why we can't come up with a reasonable number that we think has some standing, that is worth putting out to the public, and if the public wants to push back, let the public push back. But we put a number out there at the point where we notify this, and let our TAs come back and moan and groan, and let everybody else moan and groan, and so what? So what?
Rick, you're so patient.
Could I just suggest that we make some progress here? I thought we were going to have a discussion with some particularity about some of the issues. We're going to start with the issue of enhancement. What I'd like
Rick,
to hear...
just to interrupt you, Tom's saying that if you have the flow enhancement as just as a backup to number 2.
But we agree with that. I thought we'd agreed with that yesterday.
We did.
Why are we revisiting this?
Well,
I thought we'd agreed to
I'm
it.
not sure we have, and we certainly haven't heard any detail about what exactly is acceptable.
But that's the point of having this discussion, is that what we heard yesterday, I was listening very carefully, was that there was no blanket, complete opposition to enhancement, but there were deep concerns about it. So I just thought, let's go through and describe what those concerns are. When we've got that, let's move forward. And I heard the chair articulate very clearly yesterday that this was seen as a backup for those periods of time. It was really tight. There was no other option here. Let's think about it. And that's what I felt the meeting went back to. So let's just hear about enhancement and move on. So I'd like to have issues to be described so we can then get our heads around and say, well, can we fix this?
How do our advisors
Yep.
feel about that?
Really. Yep.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think one of the things that resonates for me that I probably wasn't aware of in reading all the telephone books worth of good information was that the plan is predicated on flow enhancement being part of it. So to have a Section 32 compliant plan, you necessarily have to have a flow enhancement regime of some sort, is now my understanding.
If I could explain, Mr. Chair, the new modelling gave a different understanding about how water abstraction affected flows in connected waterways. And the understanding was that actually the cumulative effect of all of the groundwater takes was significant both in the lowland streams and the Nararora River. And so the obligation placed on the tank group was to come up with a solution for managing those adverse effects. Traditionally, we would have minimum flows where abstraction was cut off, but the modelling was showing that that actually wasn't an effective solution. So other solutions were also modelled, including reductions, different levels of reductions, and the idea of the flow enhancement. So it was one of many options that was modelled to address the stream depletion effect that we now know to be different than what it used to be.
Even at 90?
Even at 90, yeah.
And then thank you, Marianne, we had I think quite a useful discussion around the lowering potentially of the 90 through to another number. And we asked, and it's probably my mistake, I think, in the workshop to ask offline the very helpful hydrologist who was there, at what number did he think you wouldn't require flow enhancement? And my understanding was you would require flow enhancement at any number. And I don't think you would, yes. So even at zero take, you still require flow enhancement. Is that correct?
If you wanted to maintain flows above what would naturally occur.
And I think there's a function of the time delay.
Right, okay. So in providing our advice in our assessment table, and I underline our advice, so we provide independent advice to tangata whenua representatives, so it's Ricky and my view, it's not the view of tangata whenua. I want to express that very clearly as you read through this table. We identified that potentially there were some issues with the way that flow enhancement was currently worded. So if you're of a mind to look at the track change version of Plan Change 9.1 on page 30, it's policy 36. If you have that in front of you, and I do apologise, my table doesn't really include those policies. We're a bit strapped for time.
Give us the number again.
And conscious of paper overload.
Reference again, please.
It'll be policy 36, page 30 of the track change version, if you have that in front of you.
Or 31 of the...
Yeah,
32 of the agenda papers, actually. The attachments.
So in pure nursery rhyme style, I shall read it to you. And I don't have an A3 copy to look like a nursery rhyme book, but
Page 30 in the other one.
effectively it is the council will remedy, comma, or offset if remedying is not practicable, comma, the stream depletion effects and effects on tikanga and Mātauranga Māori of groundwater takes in the Hetatonga Plains Water Management Zone on the Karamu River and its tributaries by. And then it goes on to list a number of things. The key concern to Ricky and I in assessing that was, is that offset or mitigation or remedy really going to offset those effects on tikanga and Mātauranga Māori? And there's a question that we pose to tangata whenua reps, because not being tangata whenua representatives can't judge that and can't form a view on it. And I think you heard at the workshop yesterday that does not, the way it's currently proposed. Now that doesn't mean to say that it could not, and I'll use the words could not, do that. And that, as I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected on this from the workshop yesterday, was one of the nubs of the issue. So if you couldn't remove it and reduce your abstraction all the way down without having other unintended consequences, then you had to have it, and if you have to have it, then it needs to do what it says it's going to do. And if it's not going to be an offset of tikanga and Mātauranga Māori, then either you remove that term or you make it do that.
So if we remove that term and we accept that it has some ecological benefit but does not offset the effects on tikanga and Mātauranga, and yet the plan fundamentally depends on this section, do we end up in a position where the argument then becomes that the plan overall does not provide for what it needs to in Part 2 of the Act? Is that where you're going?
In my view, yes, but
Right.
I'm happy
It's good
to
to
hear
flush
from
that
Marianne
out.
and Kerry, because they might have a different view.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, if we're saying that's what it does, then we need to follow through and actually show that that's what it will do. Otherwise, we're saying, oh, this is going to mitigate or remedy, but then it doesn't.
So have you got any sense of how it could?
Well, that's I don't have necessarily answers. I can see problems, but we've got a lot of great minds around this table, so I'm hoping we can find some
I'll just
answers.
let them continue that answer. Yes, we've got something relevant there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the point we're making here, though, is that we are trying to make a decision here today. And what I suggested yesterday was an alternative. Why don't we make this a matter that if you're going to do this, then it's a matter that requires a resource consent. It's therefore a consenting process, and therefore...
It does require a resource.
Well, that's right. So at that point you go through, then all of these discussions can be had, and we've got all the arguments about what we have to do as mitigation, et cetera, and deal with those arguments at that point.
So in my view, as a planner, the plan doesn't currently provide you with enough certainty that you would get good outcomes that would then achieve that goal.
So what would you need in the plan to give you confidence about the outcomes?
And I think that's probably the subject of something we need to talk about what a good outcome looks like, and perhaps that's engagement with tangata whenua, so they can tell you when those tikanga and Mātauranga Māori matters are taken care of in terms of a flow enhancement scheme, and then you would back in that outcome into the plan, if you want to do it that way.
So that's the principal approach. I guess just getting really practical about this, where we get to is a complete relitigation of the fundamental proposition here, which is that to provide for those values, from what we're hearing, is you would need a high level of spring concentrate, in the absence of augmentation, spring-fed contribution to the lowland streams, which takes you back to a significant reduction in water take during dry times of the year. So I guess what I'm concerned is we don't try and take this offline and resolve something which fundamentally can't be resolved, because it goes to this whole construct of whether we are going to significantly reduce water takes across the Heritonga zone to get those spring-fed contributions to the lowland streams to a point that they're both ecologically and culturally acceptable.
James, 30, in this same section that we're looking at now, number 37, the last point in it basically says, hey folks, if it doesn't work, we're going to have to come back and come up with an alternative method, examine the benefits and costs, and so forth. It seems to me that the position is hedged, so to speak. And it's put in there as here's what we want to do. We want it to work. If it doesn't work, that water use is going to be subject to water take restrictions when an applicable flow trigger is reached. Further on, it says if we can't come up with a scheme that produces the desired effect, we're going to have to go to Plan B, and God knows what Plan B is. basically, that's what it says.
The review clause, you're talking about 38, the groundwater management review?
Well, I didn't get that far down. I just was, the point ahead of it, it says the council will, remedy the stream depletion effects, blah, blah, blah. But if it can't, if a scheme is feasible, it'll then develop options for funding, construction, and operation of such schemes. If it's not feasible, then we're back to the drawing board. Identify alternative methods, and I examine the costs and benefits of those.
If I may make a suggestion, perhaps, and on reflection, maybe those terms in policy 36 were not appropriately placed just in that policy. And what we need to remember is it's just not one thing that we're doing to address the problems we've created by not understanding our resources well enough and not placing limits on them in time. So we need to have a comprehensive set of policies and rules that address those issues. This is just one of those things. So maybe what I'm suggesting is that we reconsider those terms in that policy and perhaps come up with some overall statement that more reflects the, I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but certainly make it a little bit more holistic in terms of there are a number of policies that will seek to better provide for all of the values that we're trying to manage for.
So it's a good process solution. I am concerned, though, that we will end up straight back at the point that in the absence of dealing with the abstraction and its physical effects, we've got relatively limited levers in the plan that are going to deliver on this concern or address this concern.
Can I offer a second? I mean, having looked at what Naya put up on the board yesterday, which was really useful, Naya, to actually have that up there in black and white so we could see it. To my mind, the biggest, or the big concern that was raised there was that when we were looking at enhancement, it was about that we weren't enhancing right up the reach of the stream. We weren't enhancing right up to the spring. Would that be fair to say? No, that was from what you were saying to us, telling us yesterday.
That's the biggest concern.
It's the biggest concern. Okay, so if
we're replacing our springs with taps.
Yep.
We're saying that we're actually enhancing the stream network. When these parts that aren't being enhanced, they're being degraded and springs are stopping. That's the fundamental cultural difference and struggle with the whole scheme.
So yeah, Paul, I heard yesterday that actually if we redesign and try to be more representative in terms of where the taps are further up the catchment, it's still not going. This is a fundamental objection to the concept.
That's not feasible anyway. Even if it wasn't, points there's 100 springs, you're going to put 100 taps in it, and as one hydrologist said, it's just a Ponzi scheme. That was the issue, and I'm grateful we got to a point yesterday where we identified that there was a real issue for whenua. I think previously not only was there apparently not an issue for Tauranga whenua, but it was for us, despite our participation and discussions.
So unfortunately, I don't think that's a way through. I think we're back at the point that this is far more fundamental, and we're back at this question of whether, in particularly dry times of year, we need to put water users across the Heritonga system onto ban so that we can minimise the reduction in upward pressure coming from the aquifer that's filling the spring-fed streams. This is where this goes.
Yeah, it's fundamental, Neil.
It's as simple as that. It's one or the other.
Mr Chair, picking up on Marianne's comment, I wonder whether in fact at 36 we do have a remedies table introducing from the plan the various elements she's saying are the bigger picture, and I'm interested to know whether a combination of augmentation and other approaches is a sufficient remedy. Does that help articulate that flow enhancement regime?
It was a suggestion. I'm
Yeah, well,
hopeful
it's
that
a
it
good
would.
suggestion, and I'm just wondering whether there we can install at 36 can put in a remedies table.
It would go before 34 at the top.
Oh, yes, yeah, okay.
So can you explain what a remedies table is that you're suggesting?
Well, I'm not sure what it looks like yet, but it's the idea that we've got quite a difficult and complex problem to resolve, and that we are taking a multi-solution approach, as it were. So it's the allocation limit itself, the reductions to actual and reasonable, the labelling of the resource as over-allocated, not allowing new allocations and if we make savings, so keeping water that's made available through efficiencies unallocated. So there's a whole range of things that are going to happen in the Hiratonga Plains, not just this one policy.
But in relation to the area that we've identified here, which is the management zone on the Karamu River, we're looking at the particular effects on that. How do all those various remedies affect that?
I'm not sure of the zone that you refer to.
Oh, it's in section 36, policy 36.
Oh, so that's the Hiratonga Plains Aquifer Management Unit. So it's the whole plains and the connected water bodies.
Yeah, so you've mentioned all those other strategies. How are they going to effectively offset stream depletion and the effects on all those values?
This one policy is the one that deals with the offsetting of the stream depletion. The other ones are around trying to reduce the amount of water that's being allocated.
Yes, so
we need an indication really whether the whole package in the round satisfies the need to protect those values.
All the other provisions that have to do with efficiency and are nothing more than methods, techniques to keep more water in the ground. That's all. And so that's why the savings goal is so important to the whole construct here. That the more water you keep in the ground, the better off we're all going to be. But we have a seasonal issue here to shift some water from one spot to another that hopefully would have some environmental benefit. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Then we're back to the drawing board.
But Mr. Chair,
Doesn't.
Mr. Chair, if to move things along, if in fact we had what I've described as a remedies table, and there's some analysis as to the combined effect of that in terms of flow enhancement, are we getting closer to, particularly if we put targets in against them, are we getting closer to a satisfactory articulation of the issue?
I think we need to stop there. I'm not suggesting you are, but it seems a little bit like we're thinking about this in binary terms, that you either do this or don't do it. Waka toa, it's not forever. This is if we see this as a short-term solution to a problem we've got, that water's over-allocated, to turn that tap off tomorrow would put a whole lot of businesses at risk and do negative effects that we don't want to incur. So we use this as a tool to get us over a hump that says, if we're going to apply what Mary Ann just said, actual and reasonable use will cut back water use. We just leave that water in the ground. We've got, therefore, less coming out. We can drive efficiency through all sorts of methods, whether that's charges on water use or all sorts of tools you can use for that. If you do that, then you're going to reduce use again, so you're going to be closer to a target which doesn't require this to occur. And I think that's what these guys are saying, is that, philosophically opposed to the concept, because, you can't replace natural flow with a tap, and I understand that. But I think there would be, talking to these guys, I think there's some acceptance that this is a tool in the interim to get us to a point where we can, all work together to achieve a better outcome for the environment and maintain the economy, the Hawke's Bay economy. And that's that balance that I think we know. It's not about flow enhancement in a little box saying this is about flow enhancement. It's about the, it's about the 990 million cubic. Is that a target? Is that a limit? Is it a sinking limit? Is it a sinking cap? Which I assume it, if we could think about that as a sinking cap. So if you need to get to 60 million cubes, And if that's going to take 30 years, you have flow enhancement for 30 years. We have it for 5 years if it's going to take 5 years. But that's got to, we've got to, the way it's, I think, people react to it now and the way I read it is we're going to have flow enhancement, we're going to have a 90 million cubics cap. Those are binary things rather than we're starting at 90 million because that's where we're at. We're going to reduce it in 10 years to 80. We're going to keep reducing it based on actual and reasonable use, better efficiency, changing land uses, all sorts of things. This isn't just about water, it's about nitrogen and climate change and everything else. All those things are going to impact on the environment and the economy and everything else that's happening. And I think if we think it in those terms, it's less unpalatable, this concept.
Well, that's where I'm coming from. If we're able to articulate it and demonstrate and put targets in and tick that one off, does that help?
I think so. I mean, I can't speak for these guys, but that's what I think. If we use that sort of language rather than flow enhancement as a solution to a problem, well, it's a temporary solution to what is hopefully a temporary problem.
That's exactly what we're trying to say here. Past each other. I think people are of the view that we've set ourselves a limit, say for the sake of 90, which we intend to see reduce over time to say 80. And what people see is that flow enhancement is a temporary thing that we do in the short term to overcome a short-term problem. It's discretionary. We choose to do it rather than we do it compulsorily all the time. So it's a tool that's picked up when and as necessary, and we want all the safeguards around it. I wrote down some here. I think we could define it by what it's not to be. And so one of the things that was identified yesterday was that we're looking to take water from here at the expense of that, and so we're just basically, as I characterised yesterday, robbing to pay Paul. Well, we should say that's not acceptable. We're not going to make as much damage over here as we're protecting over here. So it's got to have a diminishing effect. It's got to have, in my view, a minimal effect. It can't have no effect, but we've got to make sure it's as small as we can. And the other thing, it's got to be a temporary effect. So if it's done, it can't have any long-term lasting effect on the environment. So, of course, if we take water out, something will happen for a period of time, but we want to be assured that once the thing's stopped, it goes back to where it was. So it cannot have a permanent effect. It's got to be a temporary effect. If it has a permanent effect, we don't do it. We must be able to define how we do that. Thank you for the interruption, Alan.
I beg your pardon.
Right.
Someone tell me in simple terms what's wrong with flow enhancement.
Pity you weren't here yesterday, Alan, because it was a pity you weren't here yesterday.
I've made my apology for that.
Yeah, I realise that.
Intended. But however, you don't make decisions in workshops. Yeah. And I think the question is a reasonable one.
I agree. Niall, would you like to answer that? What's wrong with the question?
Yeah, I need that whiteboard because I've shared these words before and without that excellent diagram.
But do you really need the whiteboard? Because
Absolutely.
no.
Chair, can I just give two simple explanations? One is that you're exacerbating the problem because you're taking the groundwater that you're already trying to manage the effect of. So it's a temporary solution and not one that you can do on an ongoing basis, but you don't need to anyway because it's for a targeted period of time.
Because you're depleting the groundwater by taking that measure.
Correct. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is that where you're taking it and putting it in is going to be at a specific point in the stream system, and you're not going to be able to compensate for every little spring that might be scattered over the landscape. So you're only going to be enhancing a part of the waterway, not all of it.
Thanks for that. That's fine.
And what Ngaio said is a practical observation from our tangata whenua is that they're seeing the retraction or the, what was the wording? That streams are contracting over time because these springs are being depleted. And so the concern was that this is only going to exacerbate that.
Well, it shouldn't be exacerbated.
The modelling depends, doesn't it?
It depends on how much we run
I thought you were leading forward. You're looking frustrated there.
So does the 80 proposal sit alongside this, get us to a place of comfort?
Probably time to speak about actual and reasonable.
I mean, there was a number thrown out. The number in the plan is 90. The number of 80 was thrown out yesterday. My understanding is 90 is the most that's ever been used within the catchment.
And that's an estimate.
stop, and
And it's an
that's a-
estimate full of a whole bunch of uncertainties, but
So we hear a lot about the fact that we're pulling back from 170, which is, you know, on paper, it doesn't really mean anything, so no user is suddenly going to be subject to less water than they have now, because 90 is the most.
Actually, not, if I may clarify, the modelling that we did the economic analysis on assumed the pattern of water use in 2012, 2013. Most of the groundwater takes at that time had no restrictions, so they weren't subject to like minimum flows or quantities that meant they ran out, so they didn't actually run out. What we're going to do with this plan change, by imposing action unreasonable and allocating an amount on an irrigation season, they will run out. And the economic analysis was done on that change. So it will have an impact on the irrigators.
plus you've got land users or landowners that are currently using a very small amount, say they're a grape grower, and through this policy will be taking away their ability to change land use for higher water use.
And that's not unusual, and that happens all over the country. Right? This isn't exclusive to Hawke's Bay.
No, just being clear that there is an impact.
Yep, no, I appreciate that, but I think the question, you know, when we talk about actual and reasonable use, and I appreciate that's a great thing to be doing. It's one tool. You know, you can talk about land use capability, land use suitability. There's all sorts of things you can measure the carrying capacity of a piece of dirt to do all sorts of things on all sorts of measures. I guess when we talked about 80, that was just 10 million less than 90. What would be good to know is if you did the actual and reasonable use measure across everybody now, what the actual number that came out the other end of that would be. Is it 80? Is it 85? Is it 65? I have no concept. So I think
until we go through.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
And I have one quick question. Are we pretty sure that the use is 90?
No.
No, it's an estimate model.
That was a modelled number.
It's an estimate.
Most people
But we also don't know.
Why aren't we? Because we're metering all the big growers,
There's not universal metering, and there is changing land use. So until we go through reconsenting and people have to table what is their land use and what is their water need, that we can reconcile all of these numbers. So we've got a modelled number that's based on best estimates.
if it's wrong, we're in trouble.
Of course.
And James, there is a review clause in there in time when you can actually do a full and frank assessment of what the allocable quantum would be once you've done that process, which is also important.
Yep.
And we recognise that.
I also think it's important that we don't, I mean, everybody's made decisions in the past that we're now having to pay the price for, and we accept that. And we can't be accountable, I mean, we now have to be accountable for those decisions, but we can't blame ourselves for what happened back then, but we've got to manage the impact on where we're going now. And I guess that's what we're saying. Is what is, you know, how do we define what that best number is? It's whether it's 90 or whether it's 60 or 50, I have no idea. It doesn't sound like anybody does right now. So the plan, I think what we're suggesting is it needs to provide for, and it's the review that Bill's was talking about, at some point we can understand, one, how much is used, what's suitable, what's sustainable, because that's what the RMA requires us to do, is talk about sustainable management, and how do we get to that point? And
So that's highly problematic, and it gets us to the I guess the fundamental problem here, and why the 90 to 80 doesn't actually solve ecological effect issue, and that is that we've got a highly transmissive aquifer, which means the water moves through it quickly, and the issue actually is a couple of months of the year when the system already has a low water table because of inflows and the time of year it is. And then you have every water user in the region all needing that water all at the same time, whether they be domestic or whether they be irrigators. And at that point in time, the system is highly depressurised. So the spring-fed contribution to streams is going to be much reduced. And it takes us back to this point that you either put pervasively people on ban to try and reduce that level of depressurisation, and that is a district-wide significant impact, and you might alleviate some of that depressurisation. But going from 90 to 80 is not going to solve that geohydrological challenge that we've got with this aquifer system.
You don't know that.
And I just want to just make sure everybody understands that we can have a reduction in overall allocation being put into the policy, but it's not necessarily going to result in those spring-fed contributions bouncing back unless we go for the other alternative, which is bans at that time of year.
Oh, because that's the point Ricky made. At zero, they still go down.
Well, yes, they will because of natural.
But it's not a bad policy nevertheless,
Which one?
reducing use.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, it's not.
No, we need to reduce use.
But in terms of offsetting the effects on tikanga and mātauranga, what I'm nervous about is the expectation is that in reducing the use, we're going to get this palpable effect in surface water flows.
I'm personally prepared to say I don't have a clue as to whether it'll work. But I'd like to have it in the quiver. I mean, I want the tool to be available.
Flow enhancement, you mean?
Meanwhile, we're on we're driving water use down as a major policy objective of this change. That's what the major thing is that we're doing. We're driving it down. And flow enhancement is Peter doesn't like the term, but it's a Band-Aid. It may or may not work. You may need a tourniquet, not a Band-Aid.
I just want to say, I agree with Tom on that. Look, science on these things is overrated. Seriously, it's a good clue and indication, but all this knowledge is human knowledge. It's not nature's knowledge. We're just making our best guess of what it is. And look, I'm just back in the space of we all agree we've overpumped the aquifer. So I think it's just a good thing intuitively to me to say that's enough, stop, no more. And our best guess is 90. We can spend months, years trying to figure out what exactly the right number is. We'll probably come to 89.9. But I'm just happy to say, right, that's it. The second thing I'm happy to say, less is going to be better. I'm not sure how much better, but no one knows about it. But less is going to be better, and just tell the community it's going to go. And I want a number that we can justify and sell reasonably well, because there's going to be a sell on this. So say less is better. I don't expect to be a magic transformation here, but I do know the trajectory we're on is getting worse, and if we do nothing, it will continue to get worse. So I'm for saying stop, that's it, the cap. We use less. And in 10 years' time, we'll have better knowledge of what we're going to do, so what we can do better than this. This, to me, is the best plan we've got here so far. And I just think we should have the flexibility of where we get into a really dry spell. Are there other options for us to manage our water flow, given it's a consenting process, going and say, what are we going to do here? And we make an open and transparent decision, which is what was asked of us yesterday. Just tell us the truth. I agree with that. So if it's a consented process, we put it on the deck and we say, this is what we want to do, and we have the discussion as to what we can do or not do. And then it's an open, transparent conversation, and the truth should be there somewhere. At that point, we can manage with some flexibility.
So I think the policy provides for all of that, and I just want to be clear, I'm not arguing against an 80 million cube target or even a lower target in terms of efficiency. I just wanted to make sure, particularly in response to Ricky's assertion that we might get to a point where we don't need flow enhancement because we've got usage down so much.
Yeah.
I suspect that due to the geological conditions and the hydrological conditions, that the day we're going to get to the point that suddenly we don't need flow enhancement because we've got such good spring-fed contribution in the height of summer, just ain't going to happen. We would have to get usage very, very low, and even then, we still might not achieve it. So I just want to be clear that this is not
The caution's
not simple.
I agree with that.
Councillor Barker yesterday made a recommendation that...
Your mic, please, Co-Chair.
Oh, yeah. Yesterday, Councillor Barker made a recommendation that people should have tanks as well. And I think that if you want to have your section with lots of green grass, you shouldn't be reliant on the general services to do that. You should make some effort yourself.
Catch your own water.
Otherwise, put it in concrete or something else, or put it in trees. And the other thing point I want to make is that we are having a discussion about the community benefit, and I would not like to see people manipulating this conversation to say that Māori are using tikanga to drive the issue of wiser water use, because it is a general concern of the community.
Can you, Rick's had his dissertation. Can we buy into that? Can you buy into what Rick's just suggested?
Yep, I gave some notes to Rick that he can speak on our behalf.
Oh, jolly good.
And I was quite prepared after Rick's, Councillor Barker's last comments when, as an interim measure, to feel like, well, it's a good proposal and maybe I can shut up shop and go home now.
Barney?
You know, he's 10 years, 20 years. And I'm heartened a little bit too as well, and it's always been in my participation over this tank process that it's always been premised on, and it's in the RMA, a precautionary approach, because we're dealing with some new facets but have got an old message. And I guess when I start to look at what are the contributions that, say, tangata whenua, mana whenua have had in relation to their values, their huanga, etc., it reflects a tikanga, I guess, that you say, well, what does that mean? And ultimately you start to drill down on that, and of course, I mean, this whole debate around motive and how do you recognise that? And of course, it all has an interplay. While we're talking about terrestrial, celestial, it all has this thing coming right down to terrestrial. And bringing back that essence of life into a certain part of the community ecologically, I think therein lies this unique thing about the contribution that Mātauranga Māori can make, because we're dealing with a lot of complexity. I agree with Rex. You just get overloaded with it at the point where your active participation around the table is just so compounded by having to make a decision on things that you don't know. And so this is the new paradigm, I think, in a contemporary sense, insofar as how I see my role in facilitating the conversations around the table to articulate a tangata whenua view on a certain value in regards to, say, this flow enhancement. But I just want to premise it in this way too as well. It was our tangata whenua that actually supported the Te Raupare Twaifit cooperative, and it was premised on a number of things. One was there's this unique area out at Te Raupare in Twaifit which captures a certain ecosystem both above and below ground. So its uniqueness was supported by the fact that we're something like, I can't remember, 140 odd water takes. The drive behind this was actually to get better water efficiency. I think that's still playing itself out to this day as we're starting to see some really, really good numbers. But it's not a transportable item where what's working over in that particular area can be transported to say, let's do it over here too as well. There are so many other ecological dynamics. The other thing that I just want to say too as well, it's been through in my role over a number of different years that there's this cultural memory that actually informs us about what used to be then, what's not now. And so we're taking that cultural memory through each part of the discussion, particularly when it comes to water efficiencies, quality and overall water management. Well, I've been sitting around the table with a number of people too as well, where we've been baffled by science, where a particular person will come in and say, well, this is what the position should be within council, and then lo and behold, that person comes and there's a contra view that then takes place. And then we roll consents over on the basis that we're looking for some rules, some standards, and then all of a sudden there's another change in science. And we're sitting back, this is what our cultural memory is actually saying, looking at, is that there's no consistency because we're dealing with some hard and complex issues. I know that. And of course for tangata whenua participation, active participation in this space, it is really trying to get ourselves around a new sense of tikanga that we can live with at the end of the day. But just to follow on from what Ngaio has just said, you know, it's not a let's keep this grounded forever and a day in a rule that's going to capture us. It's about trying things out. It's about testing things out to see whether they'll work or not. And let's be honest about it. It's also ensuring that at the end of the day, our community, and it's been expressed without me having to echo this across the table, we are part of this economic economy. We are part of the cultural and environmental and the health and wealth of this community in here. And that I think our contribution around the table, and I was heartened to hear some of the earlier comments that were saying, let's take, I'm using my own words, a precautionary approach in what our decisions are going to be made today. So, Rex, I don't know whether that's been a contribution.
That was marvellous.
At this point in time.
Wish we had you here yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
Not that
Right,
no,
a
I
big
wasn't
thing running
brilliant.
through, yeah. Busy.
Can I just add a disclaimer, because I think I spoke enough yesterday, but it's been very uneasy to accept this, but I think with the discussion yesterday that the issues are more clearer for tangata whenua, and yes, begrudgingly can see as an interim measure with the issues identified. I'm not sure. There's some details that need to be worked out with that, but as an interim measure, as part of a package, and not losing sight because, there's quite a unease about it and some concerns. So interim measure and some, I guess, with the review part, the kinds of checks and balances where tangata whenua are involved in those.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Niall. So we'll rely on you to liaison and pull those 2 points together. That's one and two.
So that's the interrelated issues of...
They're two related, yeah, 1 and 2.
Yep.
Okay. Pathway forward.
Is there any guidance that we can get around the reductions? I think we did canvass this yesterday, but just to be clear that you're expecting efficiency reductions on all water users.
Absolutely. I just have one worry that you've got, if it's 90 if the figure is 90 at the moment, then that's good, then we'll all know that. But I'd be really concerned if we got that drastically wrong and it was actually 100 and all of a sudden it's a whole different dynamics, isn't it? Just to make sure what the figure is of the current use is right, because we know we can pull them back.
So we don't know that it's right, but we have in the review policy directions to have a look at the adequacy of the allocation limit, whether or not the provisions are working and what might have to change. And if we end up at maybe we've reallocated 100 or 110, we've got an over-allocation problem then to develop new solutions for. So we do that once we figure out how far we are away and whether or not the 90 or the 80 was the more appropriate.
You'd have to do 2 seasons back because, of course, last 2 seasons it rained.
So we will have much better water meter data by then as well.
And pressure, still about James's pressure. So last 2 seasons, pressure on my well, which is in the middle of Hiratonga, was positive Heb, and it wasn't the year before, 3 years ago.
So could I just add one other thing, just be clear, even if we're unsure about the number, what we are saying here with absolute clarity is to be no extra increase in allocations.
And we've said that already.
First, we're clear.
That's already given, right? There's no new allocation.
But we have said that as a council, but we want that in the plan.
Oh, yes.
Because if we don't have it in the plan, then it's challengeable in the court. But we get it in the plan, it then becomes lots of, so regardless of what the number is, no more.
Yeah, that's right. No, I agree.
Clear about that.
Prohibited.
That's fine.
Prohibited.
Just to labour the point, sorry, it's ever so slightly more. So I think what you're envisaging is that when each and every consent comes up for renewal as part of transitioning to the tank plan change, they will have an actual, they'll have a efficiency test around what's reasonable for them to be allocated.
Yes.
And it will then be granted on that basis minus 1%
Yes.
for each year.
Correct.
Stepping down for the first 10 years of the plan.
Yep.
Now, we might have consent duration that goes longer than 10 years. Does that continue cascading down, or do we Does it level it?
You'd have to put it in so it's reviewed with the next plan review, so...
Well, we typically wouldn't be issuing consents, I think, after we get tanks settled for 10 years only, or I might be wrong. Has anyone got a sense of...
Durations.
Yeah.
We've actually established dates for the next expiry dates for each of the zones.
After the reconsenting?
Yep.
And so, do any of those go beyond 10 years?
What did we make them? 15.
What I'm saying there, James, is that if the consent's 15 years and we've got a 10-year duration of the plan,
yes,
that the condition in the consent will be after the plan is reviewed, then we'll revisit whether that's ratcheted down again or depending on what the new plan says.
Yes, although you might not get an opportunity to review the conditions until that consent comes up. So you could find yourself in a situation where within the 10-year period you do a plan review, you might make some changes, you might not be able to put those into the consent till year 15.
Put a condition in the consent.
So it's going to take a year or two to do the review anyway.
Well.
Yeah.
But why would we approve 15-year water takes if we're concerned about how this is all going to work out? Why wouldn't we limit them to 10?
Well, we don't
I'm
have...
exactly on that thing.
But it's going to take more than 10, because you've got to do a review. You can't do it in 2 seconds. It's going to take several years probably. Look how long this one's taken, for God's sake.
But we will never do this one again. I think we're all agreed on that.
When is the review scheduled for, the first review?
10 years.
10 years.
10 years.
Is there any checks on that?
Within that 10 years?
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
We'll know their quantity of water.
Do we wait, do we do nothing until 10 years?
No, we've got to, yeah.
Overdue.
We know their water every year.
So it must be within 10 years.
Is there benchmarking in terms of the land use practice? Because some people are abusing, they got the same practice, but they're abusing the water, but there's no benchmarking.
We'll soon know that.
Yes.
And the other thing that I'd like to say is that if a grower comes in from Twyford or wherever, and he's got his 5-year average, it needs to be what he used in the drought. Because we know in the drought that the Twyford growers use 47% of their allocation. So we knew that we were incredibly over allocated because that was a very severe drought. So if that's the figure, they wouldn't have used that much water last year or the year before, or the year before that actually. That was 4 years ago now. So we know they can make substantial savings. So when they come in, we can say, well, that's what you used in your worst year, just to be practical.
So can you comment, Mary, on the extent to which is based on historic use versus a land use type and what industry best practice would say the water allocation should be?
So the modelling was done on the basis of the information around what land was irrigated at that time and a modelled amount. So we used a standard demand model, IRRICALC, to work that out. And so that provides the standard good practice, as it were, in relation to reallocating. We're going to use IRRICALC, which will be upgraded to reflect Hawke's Bay conditions much better than it does currently, and be much more specific about how much water each applicant will get according to that.
So you don't get it on historic use, you get it on where you've got 10 hectares of apples, and IRRICALC suggests that needs X volume, that's what you get.
Well, I find, I don't know what IRRICALC is, but I do know that on the Hiratonga Plains, which I farmed on for years, that there's class 1 to class 15 soils.
So soil type use is taken into account in that calculation?
Well, I was just slightly nervous about that. On the same property, you can have 5 different soil types. On my 10 acres, I have 2. So, I just caution that we are not going to affect these growers adversely, because we're going to say that's what you use at your worst, and we're expecting you to drop 10% to 80%. They can do that. They will be able to do that, and you'll be able to win. But you've got to take our community with us. So I just want a word of caution on there. That's all. Make sure we take everyone.
You also don't want to grandfather in the worst users.
No, we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
No.
And that's what the policy is designed to avoid.
Rick?
Yep. Absolutely.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to the point that Tanya made, but from a slightly different angle. We had a process before where you would come in and make an application to the Regional Council and you get a water right for 20 or 25 years. And that's what people expected. Now, given that we're now looking at a 10-year cycle, it seemed to me that a water right of 20 years or even 15 years is out of sync with what we're trying to do. So I would want us to come back with some advice as part of this plan for a change in how long the water right is going to exist. And I want the water right tickets to be consistent with what our planning processes are. So if we need to manoeuvre or shift, whether we can do that with the next cycle of water processes. We don't want to lock in things longer than necessary. So could we have some advice on that for when the plan comes back?
The tank group did consider that.
And what's the answer?
We landed on the 15-year timeframe to allow for the review to occur and new conditions. And it's also in relation to investment security. So it makes it less attractive.
Honey, investment security, these guys go to the bank and the bank says, oh, yeah, but your water runs out in 10 years, won't give them a loan.
Well, 15 years.
That's
We've
why
all
the
got
15...
problems when the water runs out.
So this was.
No,
debated,
your
in fact.
water runs out, your allocation.
I know, but I think my point is, if we're on a downward trajectory, if that's what we're aiming for, and we really want to get the, best reasonable use or whatever, the actual and reasonable use, we really want to keep it tight. And
10 years is tight.
It is,
Pardon?
it is tight.
15 years is tight.
This was debated. I do recall it now, and Tom and Peter might recall the debates as well, which, some people were arguing for 25 longer. Some actually argued for shorter. 15 was practicable because you've got 10 years worth of reductions, you've got 10 years to review the plan. By the time that new policy becomes operative and you can roll that in, you're at 15 years anyway.
And the other thing in that is you're trying to get all the consents in a geographical area together, renewing at the same time, aren't you? So
That's already provided for, and I suspect once we get the stream depletion information, we might reorganise how we manage them. So they're in relation to the stream depletion effect. Currently it was more in relation to how close they were to the nearest water body, which might not be the same thing.
yeah, because that's another useful tool.
Yeah.
So if you try and do it in 10 years and it takes another 2 or 3 years to do your review, all that's going to happen is all of those people are going to face a whole lot of money trying to roll over their consent. It just gets really messy. 15 is fine.
That's what we're in at the moment because of the delays in this.
I wanted to hear the argument to make sure we're convinced of this. I just want to be in sync. So
Can you just paste it out for me? Maybe Mary Ann can. So we're talking about a renewal of consent. So let's say this plan becomes operative in 2022 or something, by the time everyone's litigated it, whatever. So it becomes operative. You're talking about then renewals coming up and then 15 years potentially for renewal. We're heading towards that 2040, aren't we?
2034.
The consents are going to be renewed on a staged kind of process because there's quite a few. The last ones due for renewal are 2028. We might not have captured all of the consents. There might be a few with longer timeframes. We're going to bring them in anyway with our new policy to say we're going to either do them within their expiry or we're going to bring them in sooner and update them in line with the plan. They'll get a new expiry date, which we specified now in the plan, so there's clarity that everyone's going to be with the same date. But I imagine when we review the plan as per the policy, we might need to review how those groupings are as well.
So what we're proposing to do then is to vary people's consents.
No,
we're going to bring them
it's
in.
a new application. There are some that we bring in and vary, and the rest are all going to be new applications.
Yep. So, but we're bringing in and varying some in order to bring them in line with the new
provisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tanya, it's in Schedule 8, which is page 109 in your document.
So what I'm trying to understand is that actually if our science in the next 10 years shows us that we're not being successful, this is what we're worried about, that we're not being successful, you're saying that actually we can't do anything about that under current consent, under any consents that are outstanding at that point, but we can bring some in. I'm just trying to understand when can we bring in
There's a standing provision
and when
that
not?
enables you to call in consents and review them if the science has changed. So it's a big call, obviously, but the Act does allow you to do that.
It can be done.
Yeah.
Tora just raised a very interesting point with me that if consents are given for a period of 15 years and a grower uses it for 5 and then decides he's out of the business and cuts his trees down and tries to sell the consent, he's only got 10 years. Because one of the things that I've been concerned about is that when you do this kind of thing, and I raised it yesterday, you actually creating value, a balance sheet value for people that already have strong balance sheets in the main. And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid what they've got in Australia where people are selling their water because their consents go for a long period of time. But if it's a relatively medium period of time, like 15 years, it means it doesn't have the same sort of balance sheet value. You can't flog it off because you can't do another orchard development on 7 years, hypothetically. Just wanted to raise that. Okay, we've got 10 minutes for lunch. Nia's still looking a bit grumpy.
Issues 3 and 4.
So just before we leave lunch too, the request was, when we first spoke about it in relation to
That's what he's worried about.
talking about a figure, was whether we can model actual and reasonable use to determine whether that 90 estimate was actually a reasonable estimate or whether there's actually, there might be a lesser estimate. Is it 80? I'm just trying to, rather than just say, oh, it's going from 90 to 80, and you're already saying, James, you'd have to do some investigations around 80 and what the implications would be. The suggestion we put forward this morning was that we actually model actual and reasonable use and then take a more certain, I know it's all estimates, but, you know, base the number on what comes out of that modelling.
Look, I'm wondering
I'm sure it's somewhere in the documentation, but I just can't quite recall which bit of that. I think there is some modelling that demonstrates that somewhere in the pile of documentation, but we would have to hunt that out for you and see whether or not it answers.
This may be helpful, it may not, but I don't actually think the policy we're talking about is going from 90 to 80. We're talking about actual and reasonable, and then reducing that by 1% each year. So it's the actual and reasonable might be 85, and then we're going to say we're going to take 10% off that. So we're saying we're taking 10% off the actual and reasonable as opposed to off 90.
Okay. The discussion yesterday going from 90 to 80, what were...
Well, that's hypothetical that 90 is the current number, and if you took 10% off, it would get you to 80. But I actually think the way you've described the policy that you're looking for is current, actual and reasonable, minus 1% each year for the next 10 years.
That was the request.
I just think that the council needs to be cautious and flexible in terms of this amount, because we have been told that humanity may only have 15 years left with global warming. So even if they're half right, things are going to be warming up a bit and there's going to be less water. So as a council, you have to be responsible to all human need. So having these 15-year consents, if you can't change them, we may be setting ourselves up for failure.
So we can if there's new science, and obviously the climate change forecasts were built into the work here. Not particularly helpful given how unknowable a lot of those effects are. But I think one thing that we are likely to see is that warmer temperatures will increase the evapotranspiration rates, which will mean that the water that we're allocating here will have to be stretched further for most of the users. So everything that we're doing here, which is constraining and tough, is going to be even more constraining and tougher over time.
The message we need to get out there is that we cannot be held responsible for their bad investments. If they want to get into a higher risk business, it's the water that we may not be able to provide.
Yeah, the contra to that, of course, is we don't know what global warming, how it's affecting us. And over the last 2 years, we've had tropical storms in the ocean, which has caused heavy rains in the summers. So if that continues, this whole debate, it's just been a waste of time. We don't know how global warming is going to affect us, and it can either make it really, really dry, as the science is all predicting, but so far they've been wrong. It's actually made us really wet in summer.
All I'm saying is that there's risk. that we have to factor in.
Rick?
Could I just return to the last 2 points on here, which Tanya identified, was provisions for 6C, it said recognised provides for those and the outstanding water bodies. I'm not sure that we can usefully have a discussion here on this. I don't think we're equipped for this. But I think it would be really helpful. I think the advisors and the council staff have got a flavour of where this meeting's heading to, and I'd like them to go away and have a think about those things. With the idea to come back to us with a recommendation of how they see this going forward.
How those two numbers 4?
3 and 4.
3 and 4 don't reallocate savings. That's a big issue.
No, we had the.
No, three was the Māori-related provisions in the RMA, how the plan provides for, and number 4 was
The outstanding water bodies.
the link between tank and outstanding water bodies.
I just think that's a thing that's the advisors and our team can figure out. It's pretty technical, but I just think that the idea for me on the outstanding water bodies is that I got the sense from you, which Chair, as you were giving us our presentation this morning, was that
by speech, you mean?
The speech was that what this council sees is that all water bodies are special. And that this council is committed to maintaining as a minimum, preserving as a minimum, but more importantly enhancing and restoring. That's what we want to do, and want to do it to all water bodies. And therefore, we want to know if that's our general policy position, can we in fact flow that through? Because that's what we want to do. No one's disagreeing about that. And then we get to the conundrum, autistic conundrum that James puts for us. If we're going to have every water body as outstanding, then it defies the logic of the English language, because outstanding means stands out from the others. So let's park that. So can we just say to the advisors, come back and give us some words where we can see the sentiment this council has reflected in that, and I'm sure that once we see the words, we'll be happy with that. Everybody knows what we want. There's no disagreement. Right.
You happy with that?
Excuse me, what was the third point? I didn't quite hear it.
Oh, the provisions of the RMA, recognise, provide for, and so on. This is a pretty technical legal language, and I'm just not sure as a committee here we've got the skills to work all the way through this, but people have, we know what we want. People have a clear message, so write it so we can come along and say, that's what we've got that, and we'll agree to that. Paul?
Yeah, well, thank you, Chair. I know it's getting pretty close to Kai time, and I had a list of questions, but I'm happy to take those offline with staff to go through those at some stage in the future before we do the next.
That's very generous of you, Paul.
I try to be.
Tony, are you going to do the same?
Yes. No, not usually. When we hear back from staff and advisors around those iwi provisions in the Resource Management Act, I'm really interested to know what is the interpretation. I know there's lots of interpretation, but I think as a committee we really need to be very clear about what recognise and provide for means, what take account of means, what having particular regard to means. And it's important, it pervades all our work. This is the same question that will be asked every time. And one of the reasons why I want to raise it here is because in paragraph 9 of the tank paper that was provided to us, page 48 of your papers, it says there that the council must have particular regard to any advice received on a draft proposed policy statement or plan from iwi authorities. So particular regard is the standard. And it goes on to say this does not mean that the plan change must be amended as requested by the iwi authorities, but the RPC must at least consider that feedback alongside the many other considerations. I'm at a loss to understand exactly what that means. What it tells me is what we don't do. It means that we don't have to make a change. It's true. But what does particular regard actually mean? So as decision makers, I think we need to be crystal clear about what our obligations are under all those provisions, and we need to give the proper weighting. So I would welcome, I know there's a whole lot of case law, Tommy will be all over that, but there's a whole lot of case law out there that relates to this. I've seen it litigated, been involved in litigation myself. It would be really good to have a document that sets that out for us. And if you've got legal advice on that, then please share it. Yeah, this is part of what we have to do, as well as all the other things. I think we could be well served understanding what the latest law says.
I'd like to see any legal advice that says they're able to circumnavigate their responsibilities.
Well, of course we don't have that, Todd. I mean, that's
That's good to know.
But look, what we'd like to do is provide you with some advice for the final decision-making point on this that deals with 6E, 7A and 8 in the context of actually all of your responsibilities. So there are a whole list of matters of national importance that you all have to take into account. There's a whole range of things you have to provide for. And so while I understand that the Tangata Whenua reps are particularly interested in those that relate to Māori, there's a whole broader set. And the important point here is that all members of the committee understand that your RMA decision makers that have to make these decisions on behalf of the whole community, balancing all of the matters that you have to balance, you're not just those that relate to Māori, and that applies to all members of the committee because you are defined in the Act as RMA decision makers, and there's a whole bunch of disciplines upon you about how you make your decision to proceed with this plan change. So we will provide advice on that that is comprehensive and helps you to understand whether or not this plan fulfills all of those responsibilities.
I think that's really important, giving a context for that.
Okay, I'm going to end on that.
One question about has the council, have you received any legal advice in particular for this area?
Yes or no?
Have you have?
Yes, historically, yes.
Tom,
historically?
Yep.
I want to wind up, Tom. Have you?
Well, I just think in terms of fulfilling this request, because I think it's a vital piece of information, and it'll also be helpful for what we're proposing to be the RPC induction manual, because it's so critical to the decision-making process. I mean, part of that process is pretty easily you ring Matt Conway up and say, Matt, do it. Who's a senior RMA lawyer and things like that. I spent, I didn't have a dry July night last night, and spent a lot of time looking at this, and what's quite apparent to me is that there is a body of jurisprudence that does effectively does point to a relatively settled direction, but it's also quite apparent to me that there's quite a high amount of dissatisfaction from iwi authorities and tangata whenua with that jurisprudence. So I suppose what would be good to get some feedback in terms of if we just went away and commissioned a piece of work that kind of did a situational rep of those issues and looked at the resource management laws, that would be part of it. But it feels like there needs to perhaps be some more balance in that analysis, and I'd be happy to take any guidance in terms of that, because I I have a view about where that analysis will point and what the reaction will be to that analysis.
So would that legal advice inform that?
Yes, but it won't resolve it, I think, is the point that Tom's making. And it might not resolve it to your satisfaction. So that we're straying into territory where this committee is going to have to make some judgments about the extent to which these matters have been provided for, or what particular regard actually means in practice. And we are potentially going into really challenging territory from a legal point of view. But look, to some extent, you've all got to... Yep, it is your job. It is your job.
That's right. Wind us up.
One last thing.
We could spend 12 months on it, though. That's the thing just to be aware of.
One last thing. We're going to have a meeting sometime in the near future where all this will come back to us again for presumably a decision. It's all right. And we're going to have some work done in the background by the advisors and so on. Can I just suggest, as a preliminary to that paper going out, there'll be a meeting with the co-chairs, the deputy co-chairs and the advisors to go over the paper to satisfy ourselves that we think we've got the right balance here. And then when we've done that, we can then put the paper out, and when people get the paper and read it, know that other eyes have looked over it and they're reasonably comfortable with it.
I support that.
I support that.
I sort of support that.
So if the process of pulling that back together, I mean, we'll go as hard and fast as we can. Effectively compromise that time frame and that ability to bring that step in and have that time, given what the discussion we had on the meeting. Am I taking that the preference would be to take the time to do the work and go through that step rather than try and When's the next
Some of that
RPC?
have
14th of
already been
August.
done in relation to this exercise, I think is where we were going.
I'm just cautious based on
Look,
experience.
we need to make, we're asking for information so we can make a decision. So if the compromise is less information and asking us to make a decision, that's probably not a good compromise.
Okay, we're going to stop for lunch now. Now, I need to meet all the councillors, and where are we meeting, James? Just, it'll take literally 5 minutes. Okay. I know you're hungry.
Sounds good, Chief.
And if we don't want town to finish, we eat all the lunch. Peter Pucker, leave us some lunch.